It was just an ordinary night, or so I thought. I was alone at home, the silence only broken by the faint ticking of the clock. There's something unsettling about the quiet, something that makes your mind play tricks on you. But I wasn't thinking about that at the time. I just stepped into the bathroom, my bare feet cold against the tile floor, the soft glow of the bathroom light casting shadows across the room. As I looked into the mirror, I could feel the air grow heavy, almost suffocating. The reflection staring back at me seemed off, but I couldn't place why. I should have turned away. I should have walked out of that bathroom, but instead, I kept looking. And that's when it appeared. What you're about to hear is a true story, narrated in the first person. It's not just a tale of sleep paralysis or a bad dream. It's something far more sinister. What started as a seemingly normal night quickly turned into a waking nightmare that I couldn't escape from. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and share this video with anyone who enjoys exploring the darker side of reality. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, brace yourself as we unravel this chilling experience, one that will leave you questioning what you see in the mirror when you're all alone. The night it happened, everything felt strangely normal. That is, until it wasn't. I found myself standing before the mirror, staring at my own reflection, like I had done countless times before. But that night, the reflection felt different, as though the version of me staring back was somehow wrong. I couldn't explain it. A cold shiver crept down my spine as the room seemed to shift. The light overhead flickered, and the atmosphere thickened, wrapping around me like an invisible force. It was the kind of silence that didn't just surround you. It pressed into you, as if the very air itself was trying to warn me of something I didn't want to face. That's when I noticed it. Just a flicker at first. A shadow. A presence. Something behind me that hadn't been there before. My heart began to pound in my chest as I stood frozen, unable to turn away, unable to blink. The figure was there, in the mirror, standing behind me. Its features were blurry, indistinct, like smoke clinging to the air, but its presence was undeniable. My throat tightened, fear gripping me as I realized I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was trapped in that moment, held captive by the reflection in front of me. The bathroom, a place so ordinary, had suddenly become something else, something unfamiliar and terrifying. The cold, sterile tiles that once seemed harmless now felt like an icy tomb beneath my feet. The mirror, reflecting every corner of the small room, had turned into a portal to something darker, something I could neither understand nor control. The soft hum of the bathroom fan droned on, but even that sound, once comforting in its monotony, now carried an eerie, unnatural weight. The light above flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that twisted and writhed on the walls, as if alive. Every breath I took seemed to grow heavier, more labored, as though the air had thickened into a suffocating fog. I was standing there, frozen, staring at my own reflection. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The reflection didn't feel like me anymore. It felt like a stranger staring back, an intruder wearing my face. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, but unmistakably, as if I had suddenly stepped into a place where I didn't belong. The familiar surroundings were now drenched in an overwhelming sense of dread, an unshakable feeling that I was not alone. And yet, I was alone. Or at least, I should have been. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, growing darker and more menacing by the second. My reflection flickered for just a moment, a blink-and-you-miss-it moment, but it was enough. Enough to send a cold rush of fear surging through me. The figure behind me, that impossible figure, lingered just at the edge of my vision, a silhouette that didn't belong in the reflection. I dared not turn around. I couldn't. The feeling of being watched, of being studied, crawled over my skin like thousands of invisible eyes. Every fiber of my being screamed to leave, to run, but my legs refused to move. The room, once ordinary and mundane, had become a stage for something sinister. The mirror was no longer just glass. It had become a window to something far more dangerous, far more malevolent. I felt the temperature drop, a biting cold seeping into my bones, making my breath come out in visible, shallow puffs. The silence grew louder, oppressive, as if the very air was thick with anticipation, waiting for something to happen. And that's when the fear truly set in. The fear that I wasn't in control anymore. Something else was. Something lurking just out of sight, watching from the other side of the glass, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The whispers grew louder, now crawling across the walls like a wave of hushed voices, echoing from every direction. It was as if the room itself had come alive, breathing, shifting, observing. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, each pulse quicker than the last, but my body remained locked, frozen in place, as though the very air had thickened around me, holding me still. My reflection, that thing in the mirror, wasn't just my reflection anymore. I could see it now, the shadowy figure standing behind me, lingering just out of focus. Its outline was unclear, but I could feel its presence, and it was growing stronger. There was an unmistakable sensation that whatever this was, it wasn't just watching, it was waiting. The sensation of being watched became unbearable, like invisible eyes digging into my skin, crawling over every inch of me. I tried to move again, to force my legs to respond, but they felt like lead, rooted to the ground, as if some unseen force held me captive. I could feel my throat tighten, a scream rising up, but when I opened my mouth, no sound came. The room felt too small, suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on me, inch by inch. My breaths came shallow and fast, each one harder to take than the last. That's when the figure in the mirror moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it moved. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form, substance, and it was closing in on me. Its face, still a blur, still an enigma, leaned closer, and even though I couldn't make out its features, I knew it was looking directly at me. My reflection no longer mirrored my actions. It had become something else entirely, something detached from me, something with its own intentions. The whispers grew louder, merging into a low, droning hum that vibrated in my skull, making it impossible to think clearly. I tried to scream again, but all that came out was a ragged, choked sound, as if the air had been stolen from my lungs. My eyes were locked on the mirror, on that figure, unable to look away even though every fiber of my being wanted to run, to escape whatever this was. But there was no escape. The room felt like a trap, and I was caught in the web of something far beyond my understanding. The temperature dropped further, so cold now that my breath formed small clouds in the air, and my skin prickled with the chill of it. The figure in the mirror remained still, watching, waiting, and I knew, whatever it wasn't finished with me. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, everything went dark. In that moment, I felt something move behind me, something real, something that wasn't just in the mirror. A presence, cold and looming, brushed against me, and every muscle in my body screamed to move, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. When the lights came back, the figure in the mirror had changed. It was closer now, its form clearer, more defined, and though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the glass, through the air, through my very soul. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like an invisible hand. The figure in the mirror, now so close it felt like it could step through the glass at any moment, seemed to be waiting, expecting something from me. My body was locked in place, but my mind was racing. Should I run? Should I face whatever was lurking behind me? The rational part of me screamed to leave, to get out of the bathroom and never look back, but another part, darker and more curious, pulled me in, demanding answers to questions I was too terrified to ask. The air around me felt like it was growing thicker, denser, making it harder to breathe with each passing second. I couldn't tell if the figure was moving closer, or if it was my fear distorting reality, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the overwhelming sensation that something was coming, something inevitable. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, loud and frantic, but it was drowned out by the whispers that seemed to echo from within the walls. They were clearer now, almost forming words, though they still eluded me. The urge to turn around, to confront whatever was lurking behind me, was almost unbearable. But what if I turned and it was real? What if that thing in the mirror wasn't just a reflection? What if it was waiting for me to acknowledge it, to give it power, by simply looking? My thoughts spiraled, panic rising as the figure in the mirror remained motionless, yet impossibly alive. I tried to take a step back, but my legs refused to move, as if they were rooted to the floor. The only thing I could move was my eyes, darting between my reflection and the shadowy figure behind me, trapped in a nightmare that felt far too real. The cold air bit at my skin, and the pressure around me intensified, like invisible hands pushing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. My throat tightened as I struggled to take in air, my lungs burning with the effort. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do something that would break this terrifying standstill, but nothing came. I was trapped, both physically and mentally, between the urge to run and the pull of the unknown. Every instinct told me to flee, to get as far away from the mirror as possible, but something deeper, a darker curiosity, kept me rooted in place. What was this thing, this entity that had appeared in the reflection? And why did it feel so familiar, as though it had always been lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to show itself? I knew that once I made my choice, once I turned around or stayed frozen, the course of my life would be irrevocably altered. The weight of that realization hung in the air, thick and oppressive. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the figure, its faceless form towering behind me, unmoving, yet filled with a palpable menace. I had to decide, do I confront this thing, face the terror head-on, or do I retreat, hoping that fleeing would somehow undo the nightmare I had unwittingly stepped into? And then something shifted. A low, guttural noise emanated from the mirror. Not quite a voice, but more of a growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world. My muscles tensed, and in that moment, I knew the decision had been made for me. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't going to let me leave. In that moment, the room seemed to collapse in on itself, the air growing so heavy it felt like I was being crushed under its weight. The shadows in the mirror twisted, warping into grotesque shapes that flickered and writhed like they were alive. My body was frozen, but my mind was screaming. Every instinct told me to run, to escape, yet I couldn't move. And then, with agonizing slowness, the figure in the mirror began to move. It wasn't like any normal movement. It was unnatural, like watching a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Its head tilted toward me, and though its face remained a blurry void, I could feel its gaze drilling into me, as if it was seeing straight into my soul. Suddenly, the oppressive silence was shattered by a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the room. It wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient and primal, like a predator cornering its prey. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the otherwise suffocating quiet. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, everything went dark. When they flickered back on, the figure was no longer just in the mirror. It was behind me. I could feel it. Its presence was cold, impossibly cold, like the air around me had turned to ice. A chill ran down my spine, and my skin prickled with terror as I realized I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were still locked in place, my muscles refusing to respond. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening, but there was no logic, no reason. This was something beyond understanding, something that defied the very fabric of reality. The figure behind me, it was no longer just a shadow. It was real, and it was close. So close that I could almost feel its hand reaching for me, the air around me growing colder by the second. As I stood there, trapped in this horrifying nightmare, I could hear the whispers again, louder now, clearer. They weren't just incoherent murmurs anymore. They were calling my name, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, like an echo from some forgotten memory. My blood ran cold as I realized the figure wasn't just there to haunt me. It knew me. It had been waiting for me. The weight of that realization crushed down on me, suffocating me as the figure moved closer, its presence growing more tangible, more menacing. I felt a sudden pressure on my shoulder, light at first, but then it tightened, like claws digging into my skin. My breath hitched, and my chest tightened, as if the very air had been stolen from my lungs. I tried to move, to twist away, but the force held me in place, stronger than any physical restraint. My reflection, still visible in the mirror, showed me what I couldn't bear to look at. The figure, its dark, faceless form, was now towering over me, its hand resting on my shoulder. It was no longer just a shadow in the glass. It was real, solid, and had crossed over from whatever nightmare realm it came from. Panic surged through me, but there was nowhere to go, no escape. The figure leaned in closer, and though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its eyes on me, its breath cold against my skin. A low, rumbling sound reverberated through the room, like a growl mixed with distorted whispers. My reflection seemed to mock me, showing me the terror I couldn't escape from. I was trapped with this thing that had come for me, that had been watching me all along. The figure's grip tightened, and in that moment, I knew there was no going back. Whatever this was, it had claimed me. In the suffocating silence that followed, time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. My mind, frantic and spiraling, tried to make sense of the nightmare unraveling before me, but nothing made sense. The figure's grip on my shoulder was icy, burning with a cold that went straight to my bones. The room around me seemed to warp, the edges of reality blurring, as if I was being pulled into something far darker, far older than I could comprehend. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a low, guttural growl that reverberated through my very soul. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a primal terror that pierced through every rational thought and left me drowning in fear. As the figure leaned in closer, its faceless form looming over me, I felt a crushing weight settle in my chest. The air had grown so thick, so oppressive, that it felt like I was being swallowed whole by the darkness. And yet, in the depths of that fear, a revelation began to surface, bubbling up from the darkest corners of my mind. This wasn't the first time I had encountered this entity. Somehow I knew it, recognized it. Memories, fragmented and distant, flickered at the edges of my consciousness, pulling me back to moments I had long buried. It had been with me before, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But now, it was no longer content to remain in the shadows. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. This thing had been following me for years, maybe even my entire life, hiding in the periphery of my mind, feeding on my fears. It had been waiting, watching for the perfect moment to step out of the mirror and into my reality. And now, here it was, claiming what it had always sought. I wasn't just haunted by this entity. I was connected to it in some way I couldn't fully understand. The figure wasn't just a random apparition. It had a purpose. It wanted something from me, something far more profound than just fear. But what? My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of memory, trying to understand the nature of this terror that had so thoroughly invaded my life. The figure in the mirror shifted, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. Its face, or what should have been its face, was an endless void, a dark, swirling emptiness that seemed to suck in all the light around it. And yet, I could feel its gaze on me, piercing and relentless. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something alive, something sentient, and it had crossed over from whatever dark place it had come from. As I stared into that void, I felt a pull, as though it was trying to drag me into the abyss, trying to consume me whole. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the room in a cacophony of voices that made my head spin. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were commands. Then the revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. This entity wasn't just haunting me. It was me, or at least a part of me that I had long suppressed, long denied. It had been born from my fears, my darkest thoughts, and now it had taken on a life of its own. The figure wasn't just a ghost or a demon. It was a manifestation of everything I had tried to bury, everything I had refused to confront. And now, it had come for its due. I realized then that this wasn't a battle I could win with strength or willpower. The figure was too powerful, too deeply rooted in my psyche. It had been feeding on my fear for so long that it had grown stronger than I could have ever imagined. I could feel it pulling me closer, its void-like face inches from mine, and in that moment, I understood. The terror I was feeling, the suffocating dread that had overtaken me, it was the entity's weapon, but it was also its weakness. The more I feared it, the stronger it became. If I wanted to survive, I had to confront my fear, to stare into the void and refuse to let it consume me. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to breathe, to focus. The figure's presence was overwhelming, but I couldn't let it win. I had to break the connection, to sever the bond it had created between us. With a final, desperate push, I wrenched my gaze away from the mirror and stumbled backward, breaking free of the entity's grip. The room seemed to shudder, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly, but I knew it wasn't over. The figure was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. As I backed away from the mirror, I realized that the battle was far from finished. The entity was still with me, still watching, but I had taken the first step toward breaking free. The figure had revealed its true nature, and now, it was up to me to confront the darkness within myself. The tension broke, but only slightly. As I stumbled backward, away from the mirror, I could feel the room shift around me. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating me lifted just enough for me to catch my breath, but the air still hung heavy with the presence of the entity. My legs felt weak, trembling beneath me as though I had been standing at the edge of a precipice for too long. I wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had just happened was done with. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The figure in the mirror was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for another moment of weakness. I collapsed onto the cold tile floor, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My body ached as though I had been in a fight, but it wasn't a physical battle. It had been something far more insidious. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced, but every thought was clouded by the memory of that faceless void, the figure's chilling presence still clinging to me like a shadow. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. The only thing I could hear was the soft hum of the bathroom light, flickering slightly, as if mocking the terror I had just endured. For a moment, the room was still. The whispers had faded, the cold presence receded, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was ominous. It was the kind of silence that presses in from all sides, a silence that waits. I knew that whatever had just happened wasn't finished. The figure hadn't disappeared. It was still there, lurking somewhere, watching me. I could feel its gaze, not just from the mirror, but from every corner of the room, as if it had seeped into the walls themselves. The terror I had felt moments ago still lingered, clinging to my skin like cold sweat, but now it was accompanied by a new emotion, dread. As I slowly stood up, my body shaking, I tried to steady myself, to convince myself that it was over. I looked back at the mirror, expecting to see the figure, expecting it to lunge at me from the other side. But the reflection that stared back at me was just me. My pale face, wide eyes, and disheveled hair. For a brief, fleeting moment, I almost allowed myself to believe that it had all been a hallucination, that my mind had somehow conjured up the entire ordeal. But the truth was undeniable. The figure had been real, its touch still burning cold on my shoulder, its whispers still echoing faintly in the back of my mind. I stepped back from the mirror, slowly, carefully, as though any sudden movement might bring it back. My body felt heavier than it should, weighed down by the knowledge that something had crossed over into my world, something that had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. The memory of its presence, its cold grip, haunted every breath I took. The figure hadn't just appeared. It had left something behind. I could feel it, the lingering darkness clinging to the edges of my consciousness, a part of me now. The fear didn't leave when I exited the bathroom. It followed me, an unseen weight pressing on my shoulders. The rest of the house felt wrong, like I had stepped into a different version of my own home. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the floor more sinister. I could sense that the figure was still with me, hiding in the corners, waiting for the next time I would look into a mirror. My reflection, once a familiar part of my routine, had become a source of terror, a portal through which something malevolent could reach out. Days passed, and the experience haunted me. I tried to go about my life as if nothing had happened, but the sense of dread never left. Mirrors became objects of fear. I avoided them whenever possible, knowing that the figure might still be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. Every time I dared glance into one, I half expected to see it standing behind me, watching with its faceless void. The terror of that night had marked me, not just in my mind, but in some deeper, darker part of my soul. I knew that no matter how much time passed, I would never be free of it. The figure had become a part of me, woven into the fabric of my existence, and there was no escaping it. Every time I looked into a mirror, I would remember, it's still there, watching, waiting. And so, I learned to live with it. The fear never left, but I became used to it, in a way. I stopped trying to fight it, stopped trying to convince myself that it had been a hallucination. I knew the truth. The figure was real, and it would always be there, lurking in the reflection, waiting for the right moment to step back into my life. I was marked now, claimed by whatever darkness had emerged from that mirror. And no matter how much I wanted to escape, I knew there was no way out. The figure was a part of me now, and it always would be. As I sit here recounting this story, I can't help but wonder, how many others are out there, haunted by the things they see in the mirror? How many of us have looked into the glass and glimpsed something dark and malevolent staring back? I hope, for your sake, that you never have to find out. But if you do, if you ever catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, don't look away. Because once it sees you, it never forgets. And it never leaves. In the days that followed, I tried to return to a sense of normalcy. But the truth is, nothing ever truly went back to how it was before. There's a strange feeling that comes with surviving something unexplainable, something that defies logic. You carry it with you, like a shadow that never fully fades, a constant reminder that the world you thought you knew has darker corners than you could ever imagine. The figure from the mirror was gone, but its presence lingered in every reflective surface I passed, like a faint whisper at the edge of my consciousness. I knew deep down that it wasn't really gone. It was just waiting, biding its time, watching from the other side. I couldn't shake the sensation that the figure had left something behind, a mark, an invisible tether connecting it to me. At first, I tried to deny it, to convince myself that the encounter was over, that it had all been some bizarre, isolated incident. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was always a cold weight in the air, especially when I was alone. Mirrors became my greatest enemy. I started avoiding them altogether, refusing to look directly into them for fear that I might see it again. But the more I avoided them, the more I felt its presence pressing in from the shadows. One night, a few weeks after the encounter, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing as though I had just escaped a nightmare. The room was dark, and the silence was suffocating. I couldn't remember what had startled me awake, but I knew something was wrong. The feeling was back, stronger this time, more insistent. It was as if the figure had seeped into my subconscious, invading my dreams, pulling at the edges of my reality. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow, and for a moment, I was too afraid to move. I glanced toward the mirror on the wall, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching. But the mirror was empty. At least, it seemed that way. Still, the air felt thick, and the darkness in the room seemed deeper, more alive. I realized then that this was my new reality. The figure wasn't just a one-time encounter. It had become a part of me, a constant shadow lurking just out of sight. Even when I couldn't see it, I could feel it, like an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. I couldn't escape it, no matter how much I tried. The terror had become my companion, a silent ever-present force that I would have to learn to live with. I tried telling myself that it was all in my head, that it was nothing more than the aftershocks of a traumatic experience. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the world felt still, I could hear the faintest of whispers. They weren't loud enough to understand, but they were there, like distant voices carried on the wind. The figure was still watching, still waiting. I knew that much. It hadn't left. It had simply found a new place to hide, in the dark recesses of my mind, in the corners of every room, in the shadows that stretched out across the floor when the lights were low. The worst part was the reflection of myself. It never looked quite right anymore. Every time I dared to glance into a mirror, I saw something off, something wrong. It wasn't always obvious, just subtle enough to make me doubt myself. A slight shift in the eyes, a flicker of movement that shouldn't be there. I would blink, and it would be gone, but the feeling remained. The reflection wasn't just me anymore. It was something else, something tied to the figure that had appeared that night. It was as if the boundary between our worlds had been blurred, leaving me forever linked to the darkness that had crossed over. As the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that the figure had done more than just haunt me. It had changed me. I wasn't the same person I had been before. My perspective had shifted, my sense of reality forever altered. I found myself questioning everything, wondering how many others had experienced something like this, how many of us walk through life unaware of the shadows that lurk just beneath the surface. The world no longer felt as safe or as certain as it once had. There were things, dark, unexplainable things, that existed beyond our understanding, and once you've seen them, you can never go back. I began to wonder if anyone else could see it, this invisible mark I now carried. Did people notice the subtle change in me? Could they sense the figure's presence, even if they didn't understand it? Or was I completely alone in this? The isolation was maddening. I wanted to tell someone, to share what I had experienced, but how could I? Who would believe me? How do you explain that something from beyond the mirror has attached itself to you, that it watches you even now, from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again? The figure's silence was the most terrifying part. It didn't need to appear to make its presence known. The terror was in the waiting, the not knowing when, or if, it would come back. Every day was a struggle, a battle to maintain some semblance of normalcy while knowing that the darkness was always there, lurking just out of sight. And in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I couldn't help but wonder, was the figure in control, or was it waiting for me to give in to the fear? Would it eventually consume me, or had it already done so? Now, as I reflect on everything that has happened, I realize that the figure may never truly leave. It is part of me now, part of my story, and part of the shadows that haunt us all. So if you ever find yourself standing before a mirror and something feels off, don't look away. Because once the shadows see you, they never forget. They never let go. And neither will I. If you've ever experienced something similar, drop a comment below. Let's share our stories and try to make sense of the unknown together. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and remember, you never know what might be watching from the other side.